He's a returning guest to this podcast. If you want to check out the first episode with him, Professor and Egyptologist Aidan Dodson is back. And he was in a second episode where we talked a brief summary about the ancient Egypt, which I would highly recommend checking out. And just, we talked about this in the first episode as well, but what is it about ancient Egypt that captivated you as to study?
I think when it captivated me, I was first really interested in it when I was about 7 or 8. And I think it was originally sort of the morbid curiosity of a child with books with skeletons and mummies and things in them. And then it then became more of a serious thing when I started reading more about it, reading about some of the history, the monuments, the archaeology, and so on. So it just gradually came together as something which I felt I wanted to learn more about. And it then carried on from there. Because I think a lot of people, when they're that sort of age, is when they get into their great passions of their lives. Most people, if you count back to what you've always been interested in, well, it sort of kicks off around that kind of age. And then, so from then onwards, it was simply that, like, when you learn a certain amount, you want to learn more and more, and it becomes it's almost a roller coaster of it. And also the other thing I think is that most people tend to find ancient Egypt an attractive thing, if you know what I mean, in the sense that the language, literature, art, and also their general conduct of things is sort of feels positive. Although, as we'll probably talk about later on, what we're of course working on is their own propaganda, is the stuff which what they wanted people to think about them. But in comparison with, say, the Assyrians, who quite liked talking about skinning people alive and that sort of stuff, the Egyptians, although there is a certain amount of sort of smiting and sort of that kind of thing, they seem to be less bloodthirsty in many ways than a lot of their contemporaries, or at least, again, that's how they present themselves. The Assyrians seem to want to present themselves as almost terrorists, whereas the Egyptians all seem to always, even when they're sort of in imperial or colonial mode, want to present themselves more in a paternalistic kind of way, rather than just simply ruling by force.
And we've talked about this in the first episode when we briefly talked about the pyramids as well. They didn't in fact kill their slaves after they finished the pyramids.
Now, Hollywood has got a lot to answer for in people's understanding or misunderstanding of history. So many people tend to take the view of whatever a Hollywood version of it is must be true. Well, of course, it isn't. And so the key point about the building of pyramids is that the workforce, at least the permanent workforce, were all skilled artisans who were working for pay rather than being in any way sort of forced. There probably were, during certain times of the year, people who were conscripted in to do a bit of manual labour. For example, farmers during the time that the fields were under the annual flood, to move around big blocks. But fundamentally, it was done by professionals. And that's really the case pretty well all the building work in Egypt, because the only way you're going to be able to produce this kind of stuff is by skilled people. You cannot force people to do decent quality work. So there's...
And killing them certainly doesn't help.
Yeah. So leaving aside any moral scruples, it's also a practical thing. You're far better off with a small group of well-trained, well-paid professionals to do these jobs than you are trying to use forced labor.
We are going to get into pharaohs, which is today's topic. But I wanted to ask, where do the myths that the pharaohs killed their slaves after building the pyramids drop from? I mean, you said Hollywood, but is there more to it than just Hollywood?
Not really, no. I think it's all just to do with, again, I don't think any has ever been suggested in sort of in a serious source. I think there was but going back to the late 19th century, there were some thoughts when it was thought that the Valley of the Kings was a completely secret place, and therefore to keep the tomb secret, would you then kill your workforce? But I'm not sure it was never. I think it was anything which was ever put forward seriously by Egyptologists. It was simply people who are sort of fantasizing about what might happen. And there's also, I think, there's also a bit of biblical stuff in here, of course, that Egypt first appears in the Old Testament as the place where the Israelites are enslaved by Pharaoh, and then there's the Exodus and so on. So the idea of Egypt as a place of forced labor, of slaves, so I think is also part of it. So there's a late 19th century animus, I suppose, which then is sort of, then they extrapolate that into, well, then you kill your workmen so to keep the secrets and all those sorts of things, which of course, as we knew more at the moment we started knowing more about these workmen, the fact they were all literate, they were all skilled artisans, and they sort of lived in dynasties of their own alongside the pharaohs, that all became complete nonsense. However, that kind of dramatic side of things found its way into fiction and then picked up by Hollywood, and I think that's really where those sort of myths come from. And the problem is that Hollywood continues to perpetuate these kinds of myths, which is particularly annoying for Egyptologists, because even when Hollywood or other media hire an Egyptologist as a technical advisor, they normally completely ignore them. They sort of have them there as sort of on the titles. But a number of friends of mine have been advisors for Hollywood things, and they've said, well, no, that's completely wrong, but they've just been completely ignored because it works better as a movie. So
it's boring. Just no, go on. It's more interesting if they just they die after the film is built.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's I guess the problem, that there's all that people. Well, therefore, then when they watch these movies, which are fundamentally fiction, but sort of set in a historic setting, people tend to believe that's what really happened. And then the people who believe, sort of think that the current series, The Crown, about the British royal family, is in some way a documentary, whereas large chunks are completely made up. But unfortunately, people are so non-critical often nowadays that if it's on TV or on the movie screen, they'll say, well, hey, that must be true then. And then people like myself, particularly if we get some of these people in as our students or attending lectures and so on, we have to try and sort of dismantle all of this sort of superstructure of nonsense.
But then again, don't you think that movies also help that build an interest in Egypt, that people want to find the truth about Egypt?
Oh, absolutely. That's the thing. There's always this very sort of. It's something that also goes for sort of the ancient aliens loonies as well. But on one level, you wish it wasn't happening, but on the other hand, it does introduce people who wouldn't otherwise be introduced to the ancient world to it, and a number of them will then soon get over the whatever the lunacies are, and then come to sort of to do it properly. In fact, there's one professional Egyptologist who started off in the lunatic fringe camp, but then saw the light and came across. And there are others who certainly would admit that their first encounter with Egypt or the ancient world in general is through these more dubious Hollywood or novels or sort of the lunatic fringe books and YouTube videos and stuff like that, and come with. So yeah, I think at the bottom, ultimately, the fact people have actually have got some interest in it is something, given the number of people nowadays who seem to show no interest or understanding of history. When you talk to people and you allude to events, in your own in UK history or even American history from over in the States, and they look at you blankly. Who was Winston Churchill? Sorry, who was President Roosevelt? All those sort of things. People have got there. So at least if somebody, even if they think lunatic things about historical figures, at least they may actually, they at least heard of them. And okay, once somebody's heard of somebody, you can then start telling them actually what is the truth about them. If you've got to start from scratch and explain who these people are, then it becomes more problematic. So yeah, it's there's mixed feelings there about this stuff, and I think, but ultimately, I suppose there is. I would argue probably for positive, in the sense that you even heard of these people. It's just a question of then having to sort of to re-educate them somewhat in what they know about these people or places.
And today's topic, if you've read the title, we are going to talk about the Pharaohs of Egypt. And when I suggested this topic to you, you mentioned that we don't read most of it is probably just theories. That it's not fact that we should just look at this as speculations. Why don't we know so much about the life of the pharaohs as we would like to?
The fundamental thing is the amount of material which actually survives from Egypt to start with. We have a tiny fragment of material as compared with one which once existed. Some periods you've got more than others, but so first of all, there's a simply lack of material to start with. It's like a jigsaw puzzle with 99% of the pieces missing, and of that 1% you've got, half of them are actually badly damaged. So you're looking at that sort of level of things. And also, if we're carrying on the jigsaw puzzle analogy, or is it a metaphor? I'm never sure which is the right, which it is, that certain bits of that jigsaw, we've got more pieces of certain areas of it than others. So there's all that. That's the first issue. The second issue is actually the nature of the material to start with, because the idea of writing books of history which are intended to set out what happened for posterity is completely unknown. The earliest sort of books of that sort that we are aware of are Greek writers of the 4th, 5th centuries BC. So the whole genre of the history, whether biased or not, but simply a thing presented for people to read later on and understand what happened in your time, just doesn't exist at all. So so out of all that material which has been lost, it's clear that none of that would have been that. So what have we got left? Well, we've got first of all things which look a bit like history, which are inscriptions generally on temples, whereby the king states what he did. But this is very much in the context of what a king should do. And of course, it's amazingly propagandistic. So he'll only tell you about stuff which went right or nearly went, or he could present as going right. So the possibility of any records of lost battles and so on just simply aren't there. So you've got that level. And a very similar kind of thing is what we sometimes call autobiographies of ordinary individuals, or at least high status individuals, is that those autobiographies are not the kind of sort of inward looking things which often modern autobiographies are. What they are is what we tend to call self-presentations. Again, you're presenting yourself to the world and probably eternity, because a lot of these things are you're in your tomb. It's to present to the world what you were, how you wanted to be. And in those kinds of things, it's normally lots of cliches about being nice, kind to animals, kind to your family. Also trying to show how you were very, very much in with the king, given the king was the link between the divine and human beings. So often what you find in these autobiographies, when you have got sort of some kinds of facts, like possibly having taken part in a battle or whatever, it's all very much incidental to the big picture, which is just showing what a wonderful person you are. So there's that level of things. And then beyond that, all we've got are sort of beyond those sort of these presentational things, is a small amount of day-to-day administrative material, and that is really only from a couple of places. It's just one of these cases where a rubbish dump of old admin documents happens to survive to be found by archaeologists, and that's often some of the most useful stuff, because there isn't the bias there would be in these other things, in the sense that if you're making a note that something happened on a certain day in the work diary, well, that really is probably a fact that this thing happened, whatever it is. But on the other hand, the problem with those things sometimes is that often you've got lots of year dates, but not which reign they apply to, because for the Egyptians, their dating system was the X year of King Y. And of course, if you're just writing out your work diary or whatever, who's on the throne. So it's simply say year 7. Unfortunately, thousands of years later, when all this stuff has been sort of dumped, put in a rubbish dump, and whose year 7 is that? So there's a huge question about whether putting things in the right order, whether that year 7 is the same year 7 as on another document, and so on. And then with all on top of that, some things we can only really work out what happened relative to each other by looking at what levels things were found in an archaeological dig. So really, just understanding whether a king, even where a king stood in history, may be a question as to where material relating to him has been found on a site at the various sort of levels of stratigraphy. We do have a few king lists, but they're incomplete, and they all cut off before we get to some of the really problematic periods as well. So we've got this huge sort of mass of stuff out there, but none of it can be really read sort of straight, if you like. It all has to be looked at from various angles, but also, no matter what you've got huge areas where we have no evidence whatsoever, and what we have to try and do is fill in the gaps, because often we can work out from various grounds that X king was here, Y king was there, because perhaps we refer to the Assyrian contemporary records and things. All those sort of things happen. But then we've got these little bits, and to try and tell any kind of meaningful historical story, we have to sort of almost make things up. And that's what often people don't fully understand, I think, is that how much we have to make up, and how much just one new archaeological discovery can change history quite literally, because we'll have put together something which is almost a working hypothesis in scientific terms. And in science, so you put up together a hypothesis and you will test it by doing various experiments. And sometimes the experiment will show that hypothesis was wrong, you've got to start again. It's the same with this, that you'll come up with something which may actually be the working hypothesis for 50 or 60 years. And then something comes out of the ground which shows that all to be totally impossible, at which point the whole thing collapses and you have to start again on that. And that's a thing which is very difficult to get across to people. People tend to think that history is history. They can't understand why, if you read a book on a certain period written 50 years ago, it bears no resemblance to what we would write now about that particular
You mentioned
thing.
that in the last episode, that a book from 2 years from now may not even be relevant today.
Just so, yeah, it's all because all of this is fundamentally a working hypothesis. It's not actual fact. It's merely what a whole bunch of specialists who've been working on it for a number of years think possibly works. The trouble is that if that has all kinds of assumptions built into it, and if just one of those assumptions is proved wrong by a new discovery, for example, a view that that somebody had died by a certain time, and then you find a document showing them still alive and kicking 10 years after that point, well, suddenly everything which depends on them dying at that point all falls apart. So that's a rather long answer to your question, but that's the reason why everything is very much very much up in the air.
Don't we have any outside sources, like, let's say, the Romans? There are plenty of outside sources talking about the Romans. Do we have something like this with ancient Egypt, where, for example, like you said, Xi had his battle, but in his sources it says it's won, but like outside sources,
yeah, we have a few.
Lost.
Yeah, we have a few, particularly the Assyrian records, which of course have the same kinds of issues with the Egyptian ones, in the sense they're incomplete and are heavily biased. However, yeah, we've certainly got those, and the Assyrian data is very useful from about 1000 BC and later. Then the Hittite records is quite good for probably the 14th through to about 12th centuries. And in fact, we have got some points where we've got both the Hittite and Egyptian versions of things. For example, the Battle of Kadesh under Ramesses II. But once you get back beyond then, there's not a huge amount which directly links. You've got a few things which are sort of helpful-ish, in the sense you find pottery from parts of Greece in Egypt. which can allow you to say that at least that particular phase of Greek culture is contemporary with that phase of Egyptian culture. But the trouble, unfortunately, that once you get beyond about 1400 BC and so on, there's a lack of written material from a lot of the contemporary cultures, which helps at all. So yeah, going back to 1500 BC, other cultures' stuff can be useful. But before that, there's virtually nothing.
But do we have, like, you mentioned the Hittites, let's say, and the Battle of Kadesh? Do we have similar sources here, like, or do they contradict each other?
The battle, the Kadesh records of the Hittites and the Egyptians, as far as the basic facts are concerned, they sort of broadly agree. It's more to do with the spin they put on them. It's quite clear from reading both of them that neither side actually won a decisive victory. I think although both of them, of course, in their own records claim that they won, but reading between the lines, it's fairly clear it was pretty well a draw, but with probably the Hittites having an advantage in the sense that they retained control of the area where they've been fighting. But on the other hand, they do seem to have received a fair sort of quite a lot of losses. So yeah, the two taken together allow us to understand neither side is lying exactly, but they're just being putting a different spin on things. It's a typical sort of situation where you've got international things. But yeah, they're not neither side is making things up. It's just the way it's the emphasis they put on things.
Have you found that general sources when it comes to both outside and external and internal sources, that they contradict each other, or have some sources actually aligned?
Yeah, there's not much else, unfortunately. The Kadesh is really the one point where we've got a proper both sides versions of it. When at other periods you haven't really got that at all. So it's the exception almost that proves the rule, that you can't really. I'd say not until you get even when you've got some of the Assyrian stuff, you haven't got the kind of level of detail from the Egyptian side. It's just around the time of with Ramesses II and the Hittites, you've got quite a good balance of material from both sides. You haven't got that at other times. Mm-hmm. So with the Assyrians, you're using Assyrian data because there isn't any Egyptian data to put something together, rather than being able to really put the two together in any kind of meaningful way.
So let's get to the pharaohs. Do you have an idea when the first pharaoh started to appear in Egypt? When the title, and where does the title come from?
Okay, the title, as we use it in most European languages, comes from the Bible, because the Old Testament calls the king of Egypt, or at least certainly the book of Exodus does, Pharaoh, king of Egypt. That comes from an Egyptian phrase, Per-Aa, the great house. And Per-Aa was originally the term used for the palace. So very much like when you talk about the White House said so-and-so, or number 10 Downing Street said so-and-so, when it actually means the President of the United States or the UK Prime Minister, or Buckingham Palace has announced that, meaning the Queen of the UK. It looks like it starts off purely as a way of referring to the king in sort of a very much a secondary way. So you're saying this is an official announcement by the king is that. The first time we actually find it being used as a title for the king, or at least a way of directly referring to the king, seems to be about the middle of the 18th dynasty, so probably around about 1450 or so BC. And then it becomes quite common, but you don't really find it being used extensively to actually as a title to say Pharaoh so-and-so until much, much later, probably. I'm not sure what the very earliest time you can say it as a formal title is, but it's probably not until about the sort of 700 or so, or 700 BC or later. But it's the reason, but we tend to carry on using it because it's a nice convenient title to use for, rather than saying King of Egypt, Pharaoh. So strictly speaking, you shouldn't use the term Pharaoh prior to say about 15 or 1400 BC. However, Egyptologists always do, because it's simply everybody recognises it's a convenient word for King of Egypt. Like my latest book is called The First Pharaohs. It's actually about the very first kings of Egypt around 3000 BC, over 1.5 millennia before the term pharaoh was even coined, which you could argue is an anachronism. However, in English, the way I look at it nowadays is, in English, the English or German or French or whatever, because it's gone into pretty well every language. Word pharaoh means ancient king of Egypt, leaving aside when it was actually used. So I have no qualms about using it to simply refer to kings of Egypt in general.
So do you have an idea what they call themselves other than Pharaoh? What's that the general term, Pharaoh, before we
No, but generally before that, it's if you're simply calling somebody, it's just His Majesty or his person. Hemef was the sort of with the way you'd refer to the current monarch, very much in the way that modern monarchs, it's His or Her Majesty normally. They have a whole series of other titles, though. Probably the generic term for a king of Egypt is Nesu, and in very short form, somebody could be called the Nesu, like Tutankhamun or whoever you want to say. But there is a much bigger. They have a much bigger titulary. They actually have 5 separate names for most of Egyptian history, which are, one of which is the name which they're given at birth. Then there's 4 other ones which are added on to that as part of their full titulary, which are in some ways sort of almost mottos or sort of policy statements in some cases. It depends on the period we're talking about, and some of them can actually be quite long and elaborate. Rather more policy statements than actually names. But you have this 5-fold titulary, as it's called. There is the Horus name, which links the king with Horus, who was the patron god of the Egyptian monarchy. Then there's the Nebti name, which links him with the goddesses of the 2 halves of Egypt, northern Egypt and southern Egypt. Nebet means lady, Nebti, 2 ladies. That's what that means. Then you've got one which is called the Gold and the Falcon name, which we don't quite understand what the Gold and the Falcon it refers to even is, or even that's the right reading of it. And then we have have 2 final names which are written in cartouches, which are the characteristic ovals in which the most widely used names of the king are included. One we call by the Latin term the prenomen, which again is something which is allocated to the king at their accession, and is normally some kind of motto linking him with the sun god Re. So pretty well all prenomina are something Re. And then finally we have what we call, using the Latin term nomen for the other cartouche name, which is normally their birth name. And sometimes that birth name will be expanded by various epithets and so on, beloved of Ammon, or things like that. And whether or not a king simply calls himself or herself on odd occasions simply by their birth name, or by something with lots of bits added on, depends on the period. And you can normally, if you find a cartouche of an otherwise unknown king, you can often roughly date them by the form of the name, because there are certain trends you find at certain periods of Egyptian history. So so you can normally have a fairly good idea of where an unknown person might actually fit if he's not on any lists or any other things.
What does the hieroglyphs? Sorry if I didn't say that wrong. Hieroglyphs tell us about the pharaoh.
Well, so the hieroglyphs are simply the script which everything is written in. So basically,
I'm referring to inside this tombstone and
basically you've got, when just to as a general cover it, there's the basic the Egyptian script is basically hieroglyphs. Which look like pictures, but actually are just an ordinary writing system. And then there are various handwritten versions as well. So the formal hieroglyphs are normally restricted to monumental sources, tombs, temples, and stuff like that. And then the written forms, which are called hieratic, and then there's later demotic, are what you would then write your shopping list with, or write a letter with, on things like that. And so it's and basically all our data, apart from, as I was saying a little bit earlier on, where we sometimes have to derive stuff directly from the archaeology, where things were found, or the typology of a statue or a coffin or something like that. Everything derives from hieroglyphic texts.
What do they tell us about the government? I want to talk about the government of the pharaohs. So what was the government of the pharaoh like?
Right. Okay. It depends on the period to some degree, because you have to bear in mind that ancient Egypt lasts for over 3,000 years.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's like saying, what's British how is Britain governed? Where are you talking? But
yeah.
unlike in most modern states, where it almost seems to change every couple of months how you're ruled, the basic picture seems to be broadly the same for most of Egyptian history. The king is the font of all power, and theoretically everything is done by him, whether it be running the country, offering to the gods, or whatever. Of course, in practice, that isn't the case. So what we have, certainly at the period where we know most about things, which is particularly the period after about 1500 BC, which is where we have most documents about this, it's below the king. You really have a sort of a split. In fact, a three-way split, effectively. First of all, there is sort of the religious side of things. So there's the various high priests of the various cults around Egypt. So that's one side of things. Then you've got...
we should probably mention that cults wasn't the same as you see cults today, right?
Well, in the sense of all the various, serving the various gods, shall we say? That's the best way of putting it. So all the various gods have got their temples and so on. So there is that complex of organization to do with those. But then if we're looking at really government, and of course it's quite important to recognize that the temples have quite a lot of economic power, so therefore they are an important part of things. But they're more so indirectly. The direct control of Egypt is through two sort of arms who are responsible to the king. And the key and the main one, what you might call the government in our terms, is an organization headed up by the vizier or prime minister.
Yeah.
We use the term vizier, which we borrowed from Ottoman Turkish, simply as a convenient one, but it means prime minister. It's ancient word is chati, but it's clear it's the senior minister of the king, whatever you want to call it, first minister, prime minister, whatever. And he is then responsible for everything else. He combines both government and judicial functions. So he's in many ways he's both the prime minister, but also the chief justice as well at the same time.
Was it the same guy until he died, or was it chosen out?
It's unclear. They're appointed by the king. Whether some of them we do know actually retire because they then move on to doing other jobs. Like one who was a vizier, and then he sort of went on to become a high priest. But so it's a job which is you're appointed to by the king, and I suspect in practice it depends how good you are at it, how your health is, and so on. So a number we know live sort of die in post. Others we know do actually retire or move across to other things. Sometimes you do actually get father-son successions as vizier, but it's clear it was never a hereditary job. It's simply that on occasion the king decides to replace the father with the son. So it's and also there's one thing I'm thinking about the vizierate is some periods there's only one for the whole country, but at other periods I have a separate one for the north and south. Egypt naturally splits into two around the area of Cairo, and at some periods it's regarded as most efficient to have a separate prime minister for either half of the country. In which case, really that means that the only person who holds everything together ultimately is the king himself. But anyway, below the vizier, we then have a whole network of officials in charge of various government departments. It's very much sort of, what you might recognise as a cabinet government today. So you've got somebody who's the overseer of the treasury, the finance minister. You've got a minister of agriculture, a whole range of other other functions like that. It varies from time to time exactly who it is, but you've got a fairly obvious functional dividing line for the national government.
How did you go on to get these jobs? I imagine that just a peasant couldn't get this job, right?
Well, the pool from which you can recruit these people is fairly small, because the number of people who are actually literate, and because you can't do any of these jobs unless you're literate, is pretty small. Probably at most 4% of the adult population could read and write. Possibly that. It's very difficult to estimate precisely, and it also probably depend on where you are. In the capital areas, probably more of the artisans are able to read and write than elsewhere. But it's a fairly small thing. But generally speaking, it seems to be within a few senior families. And where we can trace these senior families, you'll have people who managed to produce, a few high priests, a vizier, some overseers of the treasury. So it's clear there's a whole bunch. There's a ruling class effectively, and you will bet and you will get it from there. So in some cases, you might actually have a family group holding a job for a couple of generations. But it seems quite clear that they're never allowed to sort of become hereditary. There's always a point, whether it's because the family hasn't produced somebody vision to excuse, that no, sorry, you may be good, but we need to bring some new blood in here. But of course, we haven't anywhere got any statements of that kind of thing. So this is the reason why I'm saying all we can do there is say, all we know is that after Vizier so-and-so, it wasn't his son or nephew who became next Vizier, it was somebody of a completely different family. Why that happened, we can't normally tell. The only time we can sometimes tell if the person might have been sacked or worse, is that sometimes in their tomb chapels you'll find that the name and title of that person have been mutilated, because people have their tombs built while they're alive. If somebody's come along and damaged the name or figure in that tomb, it might suggest that this person, when they either had been sacked or worse, or even killed. We have no idea. But
was it often that somebody would get killed for this job, or was it?
Well, we don't know. We have absolutely no idea. All one is saying is that there are points where you've got somebody who ceases to be in a job, their tomb has been mutilated, but whether that means they were simply sacked and sent in exile, or whether we have no idea. This is the biggest problem. That all we can say is that certain things occurred, but not the detail of what it is. We very rarely have any information of anybody being executed or murdered or anything else like that. All one can do is just sort of, infer something from the fact that the tomb has been damaged. And that's the frustration of all this, is to and also sometimes working out whether somebody even existed or not, because you have a number of people of the same name, because of some fairly common names in ancient Egypt, and there are a couple of situations where we're not quite sure whether there was 2 or 3 people of a given name holding a given job, because unless you have a mention of the name of somebody's parents, you're not necessarily sure they're the same person as somebody else holding that job with the same name, and parents aren't mentioned.
And you sort of answered this already? Was this was this kind of a shit job, or was this a job that people wanted to get? Like, this was the part you need to hold power in ancient Egypt.
I think there was a view that one should do what one could for the state. It was certainly that, but also it would recognise. But it's also interesting when you look at there's a speech which the king gave to a newly appointed vizier, and one of the things that actually does is says, look, this isn't an easy job. this isn't if you're being appointed to do this because we want you to do good for the country. It's not because anything else. And it goes through all the things which they've got to do. And there's one nice little bit which says, this isn't a cushy job. It is not sweet at all. Indeed, it's as bitter as gall. So there's a view that these, I think that the king is certainly pointing out to people he's appointing that it isn't, they're not. It's not just simply an honorary thing. It's there to do work. Of course, I'm sure there were plenty of them who didn't do the work properly, but at least the theory behind it anyway was that it was you were doing good for the state, doing good for the king. Of course, you're well rewarded for it. The king had complete control over everything, at least theoretically, anyway, and so therefore, a vizier would be given a nice house, estates, given royal workmen to produce his tomb and things like that. So there's a. But one gets the feeling that the administration was as good or bad as sort of most administrations are, across history. That sometimes you had people who were really good, and sometimes you had people who were really, really bad. And there are periods, of course, where we also have indications of civil war and other kinds of conflict. So. But those are the ones which we, of course, aren't as well aware of, because that's the sort of thing which. The protagonists, particularly people who win, want to sort of suppress. So where we do know of power struggles between sons and things like that for the throne and stuff, it's all remarkably by accident that we've got this kind of data. And most of the time, there is an attempt, in the material which survives, to present everything as chugging along very, 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 very satisfactorily and stuff. But of course, we know that in human history shows us plenty of times it isn't what happens. However, the powers that be normally want to make it appear as everything's okay, even if it isn't.
Do we know if there's corruption occurred often or not? And I imagine that was frowned upon if that was found out.
There's a trouble again. What I was saying, there's a few bits of some documents which do indicate this for certain periods, but it's again to do with the accident of the preservation of the documents. So we have a few odd bits and pieces. The trouble with this kind of thing, when you've got a limited amount of material, is how representative of other periods one thing we have. So if we've got something which is talking about embezzlement, robbery of tombs, all those sort of things, is that because that period at that particular point in time was particularly bad, or simply because we happen to have the documents from it? Like, we only have one piece of formal evidence for the murder of a pharaoh, Ramesses III, and that's just simply because in the 19th century a jar of papyri was found by some locals, who then sold them to a collector rather than using them to light their fire with, which would have been quite possible. And therefore we have that particular bit of an archive surviving, so we know about the murder of Ramesses III. But actually, we've only got half. We know from what the document we've got, we've only got half the documents, because there were clearly two jars, because the Egyptians tended to use jars as things to file papyrus scrolls in. That we only have the contents of one jar. And there's another jar which is missing, which probably was destroyed, or in that particular case, the papyri were used for lighting somebody's cooking fire in the 19th century. So, we get very excited about the fact we've got the trial records of the assassination of Ramesses III. But we don't know whether or not how common it was for a king to be assassinated.
It's not like the Roman emperors, where 50% of them was
absolutely. So we don't know. We know there's a couple of kings where then, like we're talking about some officials, their names have been hammered out of the records, which might suggest that they could have died unnaturally. And in fact, we've also got two kings who were killed in battle. We know that because we've got, looking at their mummies, we've got the wounds on the bodies to be able to see that they clearly died in battle. But again, did other ones die in battle? All you can do is sometimes when you see somebody who's only got a very, very short reign, that might suggest that they could have died in battle, or did they die of disease? Could they have been assassinated? You just don't know. You've normally got an assumption that if a king had a very long reign, he probably died, of old age or disease in his bed. But that's again an assumption. And so the number of bodies where we can actually put a finger on the cause of death is very, very small, even with sort of modern CAT scanning techniques.
So we talked a little bit about the government now and how that worked, but what about the pharaoh himself? How was it not like? How did the pharaoh become a pharaoh? Was it chosen? Was it the heritage, or was it some?
Right. As far as we can tell, and this is again because there is no document which explains how you become a pharaoh. But what seems to be the case is that the person who is the heir to the throne is the eldest son by the most senior wife. Egyptian kings normally have more than one wife, and generally speaking, from the New Kingdom onwards, one of them has the title of king's great wife, Hemetnesu Weret, which in our terms is the queen rather than just simply a concubine or whatever you want to call her. And so it looks as though, at least as far as possible, where there was an eldest son by the senior wife, he was it. But also it looks so there is sort of a number of sort of further phases which are involved. It looks as though that particular heir was presumably when they were old enough, probably to survive, because with infant mortality, I suspect that until somebody is a year or so old, there's sort of concern as to whether they'll survive. Once they've got to a certain age, they're then presented to the court and formally proclaimed the heir to the throne. And then the final step was that when the king died, his legal successor carried out the burial ceremonies. So it appears to have been a three-stage thing. And when you've got somebody who is a royal son by the king's great wife, that is presumably automatic. But if you don't have an eldest son by a chief wife, that mechanism of having the two further stages of proclamation of being heir and then the carrying out of the burial does actually mean you can then slot other people in. So therefore, if the king has no surviving son, that proclamation, he can then proclaim somebody who else there is. Whether that is somebody who is the next genealogically or whatever, we have no idea.
Could they proclaim the vizier, for example?
Well, there is certainly occasion where King Horemheb at the end of the 18th dynasty, he is succeeded by his vizier, because Horemheb appears to have no children. So therefore he appoints his number two effectively to be the heir to the throne. And there's probably other situations as well where that sort of thing happens. And as far as the burial bit is concerned, in the tomb of Tutankhamun, for example, there is a unique scene of his successor, King I, carrying out his funeral. And one suspects the reason why that unique scene is there is because that was the one legal basis on which I was claiming the throne on Tutankhamun's death, carrying out the burial ceremony. Because all that goes back religiously to Horus, the son of the death god Osiris, burying his father and therefore inheriting his mantle as king on the earth. So that looks like, but there is no document which tells us that is what the constitution, or if you like, of Egypt is. But because we have a couple of kings who do record that presentation to the court, that one should suspect that is part of the normal sequence of events. And also, when we look at kings whose parentage is certainly known, normally they are indeed the eldest surviving son by the senior wife. So putting those bits of evidence together gives us what we think might have been the constitution. but again, that's the working hypothesis anyway. And there are other situations clearly where it would be where you've got some kind of revolution or coup or something else. But I think the useful point I think there is that that even if you have sort of killed your predecessor in a coup, providing you've actually buried them properly, you're probably legally just about okay. That's what we think happens to the situation, and certainly if you look in more broad terms at how Egyptian society worked, the idea that you succeeded in your job, whatever it was, by your eldest son, and also your eldest son's final duty as an eldest son is to bury his parents properly. The picture, it seems to work, but one can't say that's the fact. All one can say is that's the working hypothesis of how you become a pharaoh.
But what I want to compare the Ottomans here. What happened to the other brothers? Because in the Ottoman Empire, it was quite common, as brutal as it sounds, to murder your brothers to become the Sultan. Was this the case in Egypt as well, that they murdered their brothers, or did they get other governmental positions?
Yeah. There's no evidence that that kind of brother murder took place. We have a number of individuals who are king's brothers who have actually got other jobs. So some of them did get that, but
was there jealousy between the brothers that I should be the pharaoh, not him?
Well, I think
better.
the thing is, I think it's not generally speaking. I don't think because if we're right about what the Constitution said, it's quite clear who is the eldest son is it, and his brothers have, unless there's something nasty happens to their brother, they're it. So I don't think it's any worse than in some modern monarchies where the younger children are perfectly normally quite happy that their big brother is going to be the king, and probably in many cases perfectly rather happy he's going to be, because it's not necessarily a good job. But so a number of them do seem to have jobs. But interesting, we only really know about them being both royal sons and holding these other jobs after the end of the 18th dynasty. Prior to that, you don't. But prior to that, the royal family is a much, much lower profile thing. Once Ramesses I comes to the throne, and they're a new family, no royal blood whatsoever, they seem to make much more of a thing of there being a thing called a royal family. So king, lots of king, queen, sons, daughters, all that are really sort of shown quite big time on temple walls and so on. And because of that, we know some of these royal sons then go on to having being high priests of this, army generals. It tends to be priesthood or the army tends to be what these royal sons tend to be doing. Again, not too different from what happens in most sort of modern monarchies. They don't tend to go into government or the civil service per se. They tend to sort of go into the army or religion. Prior to that, however, before the end of the 18th dynasty, the royal family is a much, much smaller thing. Generally speaking, it's the king. The queen is occasionally shown. Royal daughters are occasionally shown, but not royal sons at all.
What happened with the daughters? Can you talk about them for a bit?
Later on, again, or we can say later on, is that they can marry into the priesthood, they can marry civil servants, they can marry soldiers. But because before the end of the 18th dynasty, we have such the royal families at such low profile. The king has got a massive profile, but pretty well everybody else hasn't. We don't really know enough about the people as to what they're doing. And it may be that prior to Ramesses I taking over, that if you weren't the king or the crown prince, you basically didn't use royal titles. You simply sort of you didn't lose them, but you didn't present yourself as such. And there are a few people who we've got the tombs of. They never mention their parents in their tombs whatsoever, and one wonders whether some of those are actually royal children who are not, who because of what seems to be the general approach at this stage, they don't tell you that. They've just become officials or priests, and nobody knows it. It's only later on, say after Ramesses I and later on, that having royal blood becomes a big thing. That in the Third Intermediate period, you get people who on their coffins or in their tombs will give you a long, long genealogy taking you back to how they've got some royal blood. So royal blood seems to matter from a certain point onwards, but before that, unless that royal blood happens to make you king, nobody gets too worked up about it. So I think there's a difference in there's a very clear sort of dividing line between the two. But from the point of view of, and certainly the very fact that once we do know about all these royal sons, there's no evidence of them being bumped off. I can't see that they're likely to have been bumped off earlier on.
Now, it's well known that the pharaohs were considered gods themselves, but were they proclaimed god once they were pharaoh, or was that after winning a battle, or how were you proclaimed that god?
And that's an interesting one, because exactly part of it depends on what we mean by God. Because the
in the Egyptian sense, like we know,
I think this is the problem. But because in ancient Egyptian there's a word netcha, which simply means a divine being of some description, and can apply to everybody from the king of the gods through to some little minor genius. So it simply means that you are of the divine realm. So in our terms, God tends to imply somebody with something with power, with divine power, where it doesn't actually mean that. It simply means that you are belonging to the divine, the realm of the divine, rather than you being a god in the sense of being, Zeus, Jupiter, that sort of thing.
So it's not like the god up there that we.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the problem, that we know that the king, one of his titles is the good god. So he's certainly of the divine realm, but whether he is a god in the same way that Ammon is a god, Osiris is a god, is another slightly different thing. He's certainly regarded as being, and he certainly has divine blood, in that theoretically, at the point of his conception, his earthly father has Ammon or Re has sort of become incarnate in his earthly father, so that the child who is being conceived has got divine blood, if you like. But what that actually means in terms of what means functionally, what being a netcha means, is more of a problem.
We can't compare it to today, to like religion today. Like it's not like the priest worship the king.
Yeah, well, that is interesting. This is the second bit. So there's no real evidence of the king himself being an object of a cult. However, his spirit, the royal car, can be regarded as having a cult. So it's not the bloke sitting on the throne who is, but there is divine essence to him who can be worshipped in the form of a statue, and that becomes particularly common in the provinces, particularly in Nubia, the area south of Aswan, where you do have very much during the Roman Empire, where a Roman emperor could be deified in somewhere like Britain or Gaul or somewhere like that. In Nubia, a king can be fully deified, and you can tell that because you have scenes of the king worshipping himself, or at least worshipping what appears to be himself, but is actually a divine aspect of himself.
So pretty much how you look in your mirror and you say, "I'm great, I'm the best."
Yeah, I think it also probably depends on the individual king as well. I suspect some of them take their divinity very much with a pinch of salt, that they just sort of, okay, that comes with the job. I need to sort of look a bit sort of, but actually he, or occasionally she, doesn't really think they're divine, but that's part of the job. Whereas others, I suspect, took it much more seriously and did sort of feel themselves more more godlike.
Did the general population believe that they were gods? So
Well,
did they just
again, it goes back to what we mean by the word God. They believed that they were of the divine realm, so they were Netcheru. But
I just
whether
use
that,
the term God to simplify, I suppose.
yeah, it is, yeah. So whether they actually regard them as gods who could actually sort of change, decree things and sort of nature obeyed, one doesn't really know. So I think that's the problem there. Is understanding what we mean by the term the Egyptian term netcher covers such a wide variety of things, which we would include, in sort of English terms, that term netcher includes God, angels, saints, people have been beatified by the Pope, and all that kind of level. So we've got such a huge range of things meaning that, and whether or not, if you were talking to an ancient Egyptian and tried to get him or her to narrow it down, if you say, well, we have these categories which you just have the word netcher for, whether they would be able to identify what that is, or simply they would say, well, no, sorry, he's just of the divine, he's of the divine world. So it's a very difficult, it's probably one of the most difficult things to get your head round as far as Egyptian kingship is concerned. What quite do we mean by it? And it's just trouble. It's just the Egyptians haven't got the range of levels of divinity in that word, for a word, that we do. That's one of these problems whenever you're trying to get your head round any kind of thing in a different culture where you've got different words. One English word can be 10 different words in another language, and vice versa. And that's what the problem is we've got here.
So let's say, because pharaohs as well, we know that they were chosen, could be quite young, from 11 years of age, as some of them. So how easy was it for a pharaoh, if you were young, to become a puppet pharaoh, like under the vizier's hand?
Probably quite easy, I would suspect, because we've got a number who are coming to the throne very, very young. But I think again it would depend.
And was that necessarily a bad thing to become puppet?
No, what I'm saying is just it depends. It almost depends on the situation of who is actually still alive. Because if it's your mother is acting as your regent, which is often one of the default positions, if your mother's still alive, she hopefully will be a more sort of help you on your way to adulthood more than others. But again, if you haven't got that, again, it depends on how on the approach whoever is acting as regent is. Interesting. The vizier would not be the regent. The regent would be somebody else. The vizier, it's and for example, under Tutankhamun, which is where we've got one of our best bits of information, is the actual regent was an army general, Horemheb. The viziers were simply then worked for the regent. So, but again,
we talked a bit about corruption, but was it easy that he would that I'm in power even when you grow of age?
We have no idea at all. Again, because there are no records which really suggest that. Although we do, the one thing we do have some suspicion of is Tawosret, who was the Queen Dowager at the end of the 19th dynasty. She was the regent for King Siptah, but Siptah dies just about the point where he's about to become old enough to become independent king, and also his names are erased in his tomb, which leads one to suspect that Tawosret might have got rid of Siptah just at the point she was going to have to give up power. And what further underlines that is that the moment Siptah is dead, Tawosret proclaims herself as female pharaoh and carries on using the regnal years of Siptah, suggesting that she is simply she might have done something. She might have got rid of Siptah to be able to hold on to power. So that's, and also another sort of not that level of violence, but for example, Hatshepsut, she was regent for Thutmose III, and about the point where Thutmose III is coming of age, she proclaims herself female pharaoh alongside him, and then rules as joint pharaoh with him for the next 14 years or so. So clearly there may have been some individuals who didn't want to give up power, and I'm sure there were probably other ones. As I said before, we just cannot, we just haven't got the nature of the records as such. We just don't know where that kind of thing might have happened. So we just occasionally have suspicions, and so with Tuosret, there's quite a strong suspicion there.
Do we have in the Roman Empire? We do have quite a fair share of mad emperors to pick from. Do we have this case in ancient Egypt that we had some mad pharaohs to put it that way?
Again, no evidence. We have no evidence at all. The nearest you might do is if those who would argue that Akhenaten was less than sane. But that's the one example. I can't think of anything whereby we would have any basis, any way of knowing that, because again, we haven't got things like Suetonius and and those kinds of writers to tell us about what happened. So the answer is I have no idea. Well, I suspect we must have had. There must have been some who were less sane than others, but we have no idea which ones they were.
What was the role of women in the government of Pharaoh's world? Was the important one? Was she just there to produce on here? What you talked about someone who was joined here, but
yeah,
how much power did a woman have in ancient Egypt?
It depends on the period. So we do know that a number of women acted as regents for young children. So clearly, when they were regents, they had full powers of a pharaoh. As far when you haven't got that situation, it very much depends on the period. And during the 18th dynasty, the great royal wife, the chief wife, seems to have been particularly prominent, possibly owing to the fact that when King Seqenen-Re was killed in battle, he's one of those who we know is killed in battle because he's got a number of axe holes in his head, which gives it away. That his wife Ahotep seems to have been the person who then rallied the Egyptians after the death of the king, and possibly even led them in battle, because in her mummy were found 3 golden flies, which were the top military award in that period in ancient Egypt, which is never found normally on a woman. And also there is a text from after her death, I think it is, or somewhere sort of later in her life, where she is very much praised as almost like the savior of Egypt. So she certainly did that. And then probably as a result of her her position in this, a number of her immediate successors as queen also had very high status. Queen Ahmose Nefertiri, for example, both in life and also after death, she became a goddess of the dead. And then later on, you've got Queen T under Amenhotep III, Nefertiti under Akhenaten, and so on, all of whom have a much, much higher profile than most other queens. And we can see that in part because normally kings are shown on their own, carrying out things. But in those cases, they're often shown with their wives, not only with them, but on almost the same scale as them, because in Egyptian art, you're standing. So I think it depends on the period. During the 18th dynasty, we have a lot of strong women, quite often holding the post of king's great wife. Also, another thing, which again from the 18th dynasty, say where we've got most of the data for this kind of thing, is that the queen often also held the title of God's wife of Ammon, the god's wife of the chief god. Initially, that is a subsidiary title of the king's great wife. It's later spun off as a separate title held by often the eldest daughter of the king. And again, we don't have anything which tells us in detail about this, but the implication is that the god's wife is effectively the female opposite number of the high priest of Amun, and may originally have been set up as a post to provide the king with somebody from his own family in sort of in with this sort of college of priests, so that the queen could almost sort of sit on the board of the key priests of Amun by virtue of that. And then later on, that title is then spun off, and the god's wife is an independent entity, again presumably and from what we can see is she is the female opposite number to the high priest, and that carries on right the way through until the late Third Intermediate period, where we suddenly don't have any high priest of Amun at all, and for the next couple of centuries it's the head of the Amun cult is the god's wife, a woman. So again, as with so many things, it depends on period and exactly what sort of what functions we're talking about. But at the end, the god's wife is an extremely important figure, and effectively ends up as being the ruler of southern Egypt.
Would you say that the Egyptians were ahead of the time when it comes to women and rule, or compared to other civilizations at the time, or would you say it was similar?
I think if one looks across the ancient world, the legal position of women in ancient Egypt is higher than anywhere else. It's certainly higher than Greece or Rome. The very fact we actually have a number of female pharaohs, not many of them, but we do have them, indicates that the concept of a woman ruler was not, was something which was acceptable.
You can tell that to the Americans.
Yeah, and also we have things like the existence of the god's wife, ship of Amun as well. So clearly we have not got gender equality, but compared with what the position is in most of the other ancient world civilizations, it's also worthwhile noting the very sort of upfront role goddesses play in Egyptian religion as well. That Isis as the ensuring the resurrection of her brother Osiris. There's a lot of the goddesses are not just simply sort of decorative. They've got a certain amount of personality, and some of them are actually quite dangerous as well. So there's certainly a feeling that women, although they're clearly not fully equal, they're far more equal than anywhere else in the ancient world, and probably they have a better status than they have in certain parts of the modern world as well.
And now I want to get into the point where we talked about, and again, I would like to just add that it's probably just speculations, but if you have an idea that what a day-to-day life was like for Pharaoh, did he have any privacy at all, or how did that work?
Again, don't really know. One would suspect that a lot of their lives was certainly surrounded by protocol and things. Very much like you think about sort of the Louis XIV and that sort of era of European monarchs. So I suspect, and also there was a certain, given they had a religious role, I'm sure there were various things they had to do at certain times of the day. But again, it probably depended on the individual king. And it's somebody like Thutmose III, who spent most of his time fighting wars, clearly wasn't doing all that kind of stuff. He was happy. So I suspect it was again down to the individual. There was the king. There were kings who really sort of believed in their sort of divine status and everything else, and did everything. Others who probably did the absolute minimum and got people to deputize for them, and some who didn't want to do it at all, like Thutmose III, just cleared off with the army to play to play at soldiers for most of the year. So again, I think it depends on the individual. They clearly have they're theoretically. The thing is, they're theoretically in charge of everything. They're theoretically supposed to be in charge of all the temples of Egypt. So everything is. Whereas, of course, in practice, that's not done. In the temple's case, that's all delegated to the high priests and the rest of the priesthood. Most of the government is then delegated to their various sort of members of the cabinet. So I think it depends on the individual. Say some of them, I suspect, did spend half their time poncing around doing ritual stuff, but others basically said, sorry, I'm going hunting. See you next week, kind of thing. So, but of course, if that's a great thing, is if you are the absolute ruler, you can decide not to be an absolute ruler and just go and sort of do what you want. So, again, I suspect it massively depends on the individual holding the office, and also probably what's been done by their immediate predecessors. Because again, I think that if one just looks at more modern medieval and to modern courts in Europe, one particular individual can sort of set up how it's all supposed to be done until 3 or 4 generations later somebody else turns around and says, no, I'm not doing this, we're going to do something completely different. So I think that's how it probably worked.
And of course we talked about the pyramids again in the previous episode, and whose Pharaoh's idea was it that I'm better than well of the king, so I'm going to be like complete pyramid, I'm going to have my own graveyard, I'm not going to share with anyone?
So difficult to know because how far these processes work. Because now, for example, the Valley of the Kings, the existence of that is prefigured by the fact that a number of earlier kings hadn't actually placed their burial chambers underneath their pyramids. They had had them separate from that. So very difficult question to answer, really. I suspect there was a degree of individual king's choice about what happened, but a lot of it, I think, they obviously followed what had been done by their predecessor.
I just covered most of what the Pharaoh's day-to-day life was, and again, before we go, I would like to add that this is mostly speculation. That don't take this for fact necessarily, just with a grain of salt. And thank you so much for coming back. You're always welcome back to this podcast. Before you go, do you have anything you would like to promote on the social media you'd like
Well,
to
yeah,
share?
just to say that I have got a book which has just come out, which I'm one of the editors of, A History of World Egyptology, published by Cambridge University Press. That came out a few weeks ago.
Oh, congratulations.
It took me 10 years to produce, because what we were doing was, it's 23 different authors all adding into that. So that came out a few weeks ago. And I have got a book called The First Pharaohs coming out in October, which I think I mentioned earlier on. And that one is coming out from American University and Cairo Press, like a lot of my books. And that, as its sort of name implies, talks about the earliest kings of Egypt from about 3000 BC down to about 2600 or so. So it's about the first sort of 400 years of Egyptian history in there. Not only just the history of what's going on during their reigns, but also the historiography, i.e. how we know what we know about them. So some of the things we've picked up on, we've touched on during this podcast, about the questions of how do we know things, what bits of data have we put together, and how do we sort of put all that together. And I think these early dynastic period particularly is a very good test case for that, because what we have is remarkably diverse and extremely fragmentary. So I think that whole book is quite a good example of the sort of stuff I've just been talking about during this podcast.
Thank you so much for coming back again. And my name is Alan. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts. We are also on Instagram under world.h12, YouTube, wherever you can find us. We are probably there. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.